Prologue, 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days. That was the official duration of Delphine Sorrow's death. Measured from the night the river took her to the morning, a voice drifted through a market square in a province the king had no reason to visit, and every reason to have been brought to by the particular. Merciless arithmetic of the universe reminding a grieving man that the universe was not finished with him yet. The river had taken her during the Ashenmere flood, the catastrophic spring surge that overwhelmed the northern dam and sent the Ashenmere River through 4 villages in 11 minutes. Delphine had been in the 3rd village. Had been there because she was the territory's vocal healer, the rare designation-specific practitioner whose omega voice carried the particular, physiologically documented, measurably therapeutic frequency that reduced pain response in wounded patients, and that the medical corps deployed to disaster sites the way other medical systems deployed morphine. Her voice was medicine. The voice had been in the 3rd village treating flood survivors when the 2nd surge hit, and the village that had survived the 1st surge did not survive the 2nd. 47 confirmed dead, 11 missing. Delphine was missing. Missing became presumed dead at the 6-month mark, the administrative threshold where search operations ceased, and the language shifted from ongoing to concluded, and the concluded was the particular, bureaucratic, stamp on a document finality that institutions produce when the resources allocated to hope have been exhausted, and the exhaustion requires a category change from alive unlocated to dead unrecovered. Alpha King Elias Wren signed the presumption document. The signing was the worst thing his hands had ever done. Worse than the war orders, worse the execution warrants that his father's conflicts had required, worse than any official act his position had demanded. The pen touched the page, and the page said Delphine Sorrow, presumed deceased, and the king's signature beneath the words was the specific, institutional, "I am making this real act" that transformed a woman he loved into a government record. 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days of carrying that signature, of governing through it, sleeping beside it, waking into it every morning with the particular repetitive. Grief is the first thought of everyday experience that bereaved people know, and that non-bereaved people cannot imagine because the imagining requires the specific, neurological, she was here and now she is not rewiring that grief performs on the brain's morning activation sequence. Every morning, awake. Every morning, the river. Then the voice. 3 years of carrying a signature that made her dead on paper. Every morning the same sequence. Awake, remember, the river. Then a voice in a market square. A voice the government had classified as deceased. A voice his body recognized before his mind could process what recognition meant. Chapter 1. The market was in Thornfield, a provincial town 200 miles south of the capital, positioned on the trade route that connected the interior territories to the coastal ports, and that Elias was traveling because the trade route's infrastructure required inspection, and the inspection required the king's presence, and the king's presence required the king to leave the palace, which was something Commander Britta Lindqvist had been engineering for 18 months, because the palace had become, in the 3 years since Delphine's death, the particular, enclosed, grief-saturated environment that bereaved people construct around themselves when the grief becomes architecture, and the architecture becomes a building, and the building becomes a prison, whose walls are maintained by the prisoner because the prisoner confuses the walls with the person they lost. Lindqvist engineered the trip. Lord Aldrich Strand, the chief advisor, engineered the itinerary. Between them, the 2 most strategically competent people in the Wren administration had produced a travel plan whose actual purpose, get the king out of the palace before the palace consumes him, was disguised as an infrastructure inspection with the particular administrative. This is governance, not therapy camouflage that competent subordinates apply when their superior needs help and will not accept help that is labeled as help. Thornfield was the 4th stop, market day. The particular, weekly, entire town participates commercial event that provincial communities organized around, and that produced in its specific sensory noise and movement and humanity density, the kind of environment that grief-isolated people find overwhelming, because the environment contains the particular, aggressive, life-is-happening quality that grief works to suppress, and that suppression cannot maintain when life is happening at the volume that a market produces. The voice reached him at approximately 11 a.m. He was walking through the textile section, a row of stalls selling the particular, hand-woven, regionally specific fabrics that the southern provinces produced, and that the market displayed with the commercial pride that artisan communities apply to their primary exports. The walking was mechanical, the particular, automated, I am present but not participating gait that grief produces in public environments. His body moved through the market. His mind was elsewhere, specifically in the particular, fixed 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days ago, location where the river had been, and where his mind had established permanent residence because permanent residence at the site of the loss was what unprocessed grief demanded, and what unprocessed grief received. Then, a voice, not speaking, singing, melodically structured human vocal production that singing represents, and that reached his auditory cortex through the market's ambient noise, and that the auditory cortex processed in approximately 1.4 seconds, and that the processing identified with it specific, neurological, I know this sound certainty that the brain produces when it encounters an acoustic signature it has cataloged, and that the cataloging has classified as significant, and that the significant classification is so deeply encoded that 3 years of presumed death cannot degrade it. The voice was Delphine's, not similar to, identical. The particular, individual, acoustically unique vocal signature that every human voice produces, and that vocal analysts can match with the same precision that fingerprint analysts match prints. The frequency was hers. The resonance was hers. The particular, omega-specific, therapeutically measurable harmonic quality that made her voice medicinal rather than merely musical. The quality that the medical corps had documented, that the treatment records had verified, that Elias had listened to for 4 years of marriage and 2 years of courtship, and that his auditory cortex had catalogued with the comprehensive, every frequency mapped, total acoustic portrait precision that love produces when love listens, was present, in the market, in Thornfield, in a province 200 miles from the river that had taken her. His body stopped walking before his mind stopped processing. The feet halted. The market continued around the halted man. People moving, stalls operating, the particular, indifferent. Life continues regardless quality. That public spaces maintain around private crises because public spaces do not pause for individual grief, and individual grief does not pause for public spaces, and the two operate simultaneously in the specific, painful. The world does not care that your world has stopped coexistence, that bereaved people experience constantly. The singing continued. Coming from somewhere ahead, 30 yards, maybe 40, the particular, acoustically estimated distance that the market's ambient noise permitted, and that the voice's projection provided. The voice was singing a melody he did not recognize. Not one of Delphine's treatment songs, not the specific therapeutically calibrated vocal patterns that the medical corps had trained her to use. An ordinary song. A market song. The kind of melody that a person sings while working, without therapeutic intention, without medical application. Just the pure unstructured, singing because singing is what the body does expression, that musicians produce when the music is for themselves rather than for patients. Lindqvist noticed the stopping, the commander's operational awareness, the particular constant threat and change monitoring vigilance that military security professionals maintain around their principals, registered the king's halt, and assessed its cause and identified the auditory stimulus that had produced it in approximately 3 seconds, because Lindqvist was very good at her job and very good, in this instance, meant recognizing that the expression on the king's face was not the automated, grief-managed, I am functioning expression that 3 years had produced, but something else, something that the expression had not contained since the river. Your Majesty, Lindqvist's voice, careful, measured, the particular, approaching a person in crisis tone that military professionals use when the crisis is not external but internal, and the internal crisis requires different management than the external. The king did not respond, was moving, not walking, moving, the particular, directed, I am going toward that sound locomotion of a body that had received an instruction from the auditory cortex, and that was executing the instruction without waiting for cognitive authorization, because the instruction, follow that voice, was operating at a priority level that cognition could not override. The body was following the voice the way a compass follows north, automatically, constitutionally, without the particular intermediary should I do this processing that voluntary actions require. He moved through the market, past the textiles, past the food stalls, past the particular sensory life-is-happening density that the market contained, and that the moving did not register because the moving was single frequency, tuned to the voice, excluding everything else, the particular, total, only this matter's focus, that the brain produces when the brain encounters a stimulus it has classified as more important than every other stimulus in the environment, and the classification is absolute. The voice grew louder, closer. The singing clarified, the particular, detailed, individual characteristics, becoming audible quality that proximity produces when the listener approaches the source, and the source's acoustic signature resolves from general to specific, and the specific is the specific that the listener has been carrying in there. Memory for 3 years, and that the memory has preserved at full resolution, because the memory was the only remaining evidence that the voice had existed, and the memory, unable to accept the government document that said deceased, had maintained the evidence with the particular, desperate, "this is all I have" fidelity that grief applies to the things it refuses to let go. He rounded a corner, a stall, herbs, medicinal plants, the particular small-scale healer's market presence set up that traveling practitioners maintained in provincial towns. Behind the stall, a woman, sorting dried lavender with the particular, practiced hands-know-the-work automaticity of a person performing a task they had performed 10,000 times, singing while sorting. The melody continuing, the ordinary, unstructured "this is for me" song of a woman working in a market on a Tuesday morning. The woman was Delphine. He rounded the corner. An herb stall. A woman sorting lavender, singing while she worked. The melody was ordinary, not therapeutic, not medical. Just a voice doing what a voice does. The voice was Delphine's. 3 years, 4 months, 11 days after the river took her. Alive. Sorting lavender. In a market 200 miles from where the water had been. Chapter 2. She did not recognize him. This was the second devastation, layered on the first, which was the aliveness, the presentness, the particular. She is standing 10 feet from me reality that the 3 years of grief had classified as impossible, and that the impossible was now contradicting with the undeniable evidence of a woman sorting herbs in a provincial market. The first devastation was, she is alive. The second was, she does not know me. Her eyes found his. The particular, vendor to customer, "Can I help you?" gaze that market sellers direct at people who stop in front of their stalls. The gaze contained no recognition. No widening, no catching, no the particular, involuntary, "I know this person" response that recognition produces in the facial muscles, and that the facial muscles cannot suppress, because recognition is pre-voluntary and the face shows it before the mind decides whether to show it. Her face showed nothing, showed customer service, showed the pleasant, professional market vendor neutrality of a woman looking at a stranger. "Something for the pain?" she offered. The voice, close, 10 feet, the particular, full frequency, every harmonic audible quality that proximity provided, was unmistakably hers. Unmistakably. The acoustic signature that his auditory cortex had catalogued over 6 years of listening was playing at concert distance, and the signature matched at every frequency. The lavender is good for headaches, the chamomile for sleep. She was offering him herbs. Delphine Sorrow, the woman he had married, the woman whose voice had treated hundreds of wounded soldiers, the woman whose death he had signed into government record, and whose grave he had visited every month for 3 years despite the grave containing nothing, because the river had not returned her body, was standing behind a market stall offering him chamomile for sleep. And her eyes, the dark, particular, intelligence-carrying eyes that he had looked into every morning for 4 years of marriage, were the eyes of a stranger looking at a customer. Memory loss. The assessment was Lindqvist's, delivered quietly at Elias's shoulder, the commander having caught up and having performed her own assessment of the situation with the particular rapid military intelligence processing speed that her training produced. Flood trauma frequently produces amnesia. The duration can extend years. If she survived the second surge and sustained a head injury, the memory loss would explain the everything. Elias finished. His voice was rough, unusual. The roughness was not from disuse, but from the particular, physiological throat-constricting quality that the body produces when the emotional content exceeds the vocal system's capacity to maintain normal function. The roughness was the sound of a man's voice breaking under the weight of alive and "does not know me" arriving simultaneously. He did not tell her. Not then, not in the market, not at the herb stall, not in the particular, public, 300 people present environment, where the telling would have been the specific overwhelming. Your entire identity is different than you believe disclosure that amnesia survivors cannot receive in public spaces, because the receiving produces neurological and emotional responses that public spaces cannot contain. The telling required privacy, required medical supervision, required the particular, careful, professionally managed disclosure process that amnesia specialists prescribe, and that the prescribing exists to protect, because incorrect disclosure can reinforce the amnesia rather than resolve it, and reinforcement is the opposite of what the disclosure is supposed to produce. He bought lavender. The purchasing was the most absurd and the most necessary thing he had done in 3 years. Absurd because the king of the Ren territories was buying dried herbs from a market stall operated by his presumed dead wife who did not recognize him. Necessary because the purchasing maintained the interaction, extended the proximity, provided the additional seconds of contact that his system required to process the alive and the not knowing and the particular, devastating, she is here and she is gone, simultaneously experience of standing in front of a person whose body was present and whose memory was absent. She wrapped the lavender in paper, handed it to him with the particular vendor's here you go efficiency of a transaction completed. Their fingers touched during the handoff, the specific, accidental, paper and skin contact that market transactions occasionally produce, and that is meaningless to strangers, and that was, for the king, whose wife's fingers were touching his for the first time in 3 years, the particular, physical, the body remembers event that produced a tremor in his hands, that the lavender paper transmitted to her hands, and that her hands registered with the particular, slight, that was unusual awareness of a person noticing something atypical in a routine interaction, without understanding what the atypical signified. Are you all right? Concern, genuine, the particular, healers. I notice physical distress quality that Delphine had carried before the river, and that the river had not taken because the quality was constitutional rather than memorial. And the constitution persists when the memory does not. The woman who did not know his name still noticed his distress. The healer who did not remember healing still read his body. The wife who did not remember the marriage still reached. Instinctively, pre-voluntarily, with the particular. I help, people who are hurting reflex, that was Delphine's core, and that the amnesia had not erased because the amnesia had erased the memories, but not the person. And the person was, beneath the erased memories, the same person who had married him and healed soldiers and walked into a flood zone because the flood zone contained people who needed her voice. I am fine, he managed. The lying was necessary. The truth. I am your husband, and you are not dead, and the lavender you just sold me is the first thing you have handed me in 3 years, and the touching of our fingers has produced a physiological response that I cannot control, was not deliverable in a market. He left the stall, walked 30 yards, stopped, turned back, looked at the woman behind the herbs, alive, working, singing under her breath as she returned the lavender sorting. Alive, sorting lavender, singing, alive. Lindquist stood beside him. The commander's expression held the particular, trained, I am managing my own response, while managing yours composure of a military professional encountering a situation that her training had not specifically covered, but that her training's general principles, assess, stabilize, plan, could be applied to. We need a physician, Elias managed, an amnesia specialist, someone who understands flood trauma memory loss. And we need them in Thornfield by tomorrow because my wife is alive and she's selling herbs in a market. And she looked at me the way she would look at anyone, and the anyone is... He stopped. The sentence could not complete because the completing required language for an experience that language had not been designed to contain. The experience of being simultaneously found and lost. Found because she was alive, lost because alive without memory was a presence that contained an absence and the absence was him. She offered him chamomile for sleep. Their fingers touched during the handoff. The body remembered. His hands trembled, her healer's instinct noticed the distress. Are you all right? The wife who didn't remember the marriage still reached for a person in pain. The amnesia had erased the memories, but not the person. And the person was, beneath everything erased, the same woman who walked into flood zones because people needed her voice. Chapter 3. The specialist arrived in 2 days. Dr. Signe Halvorsen, a neurologist from the capital's medical institute whose research focused on trauma-induced amnesia and whose published work on flood survivor memory recovery was the territory's most comprehensive clinical resource on the specific condition that Delphine appeared to be experiencing. Halvorsen was direct, thorough, and carried the particular, clinical, I treat the condition, not the story detachment, that medical specialists develop to protect their diagnostic objectivity from the emotional content of the cases they manage. The clinical history, assembled through Lindquist's discreet investigation, was this. Delphine had been pulled from the river 8 miles downstream from the third village by a farming family, the Brennans, who lived on the river's southern bank and who had spent the flood night pulling survivors from the water with the particular frontier. This is what you do when the river takes people competence, that riverside communities develop through generations of living beside unpredictable water. She had been unconscious, had sustained a head injury, left temporal consistent with impact against submerged debris, had remained unconscious for 6 days, had woken on the 7th day in the Brennan farmhouse with no memory of her identity, her profession, her marriage, or the particular 31-year accumulation of experience that constituted the person she had been before the water. The Brennans had cared for her, had taken the unconscious woman into their home, treated the head injury with the particular practical, we do not have a doctor so we do what we can, methodology that rural families apply to medical emergencies, and had, when the woman woke without memory, provided the shelter, the time, and the community integration that a person without identity requires to build a functional present in the absence of an accessible past. The woman named herself, chose Marin, a name she could not explain the origin of and that had arrived in her mind without context. Marin was who the Brennans knew. Marin was who the market knew. Marin was who the herb stall served. And Delphine, the name, the identity, the wife, the healer, the voice that treated wounded soldiers, was sealed behind the particular, neurological trauma-built wall that the left temporal injury had constructed, and that 3 years of rural life had not been sufficient to breach. The wall was not permanent. This was Halvorson's assessment, delivered in the inn where Elias was staying, with Lindqvist present in the particular clinical data before emotion format that medical briefings require. Trauma-induced amnesia of this type involves a dissociative barrier rather than structural memory destruction. The memories are not gone. They are inaccessible. The barrier is maintained by the brain's threat response system, which classified the flood trauma as a survival-level event and sealed the memories associated with the identity that was present during the event. Recovery is possible. Recovery is also unpredictable. The barrier can thin gradually, can breach suddenly through a trigger stimulus, or can persist indefinitely. The triggering stimulus, when it occurs, is typically sensory: a sound, a smell, a visual cue that the sealed memories associate with the pre-trauma identity, and that the association is strong enough to breach the barrier. A voice Elias offered, her own voice, singing the treatment songs, the specific therapeutic vocal patterns that she used with patients. If the voice was her primary professional identity, could hearing the treatment songs trigger? Possible, the specialist confirmed. The vocal patterns were deeply encoded, professionally trained, repeatedly practiced, associated with the core identity that the barrier is sealing. A strong enough sensory echo of the pre-trauma identity could weaken the barrier, but the echo must be authentic, produced naturally, not forced. Forced recall attempts strengthen the barrier. The trigger must arrive as an experience, not as an instruction. The distinction was critical. Elias could not tell Delphine to remember, could not play recordings of her treatment songs and instruct her to listen, could not force the sealed memories open through the direct, confrontational, here is who you were approach that the urgency demanded, and that the neurology prohibited. The memories had to be reached through experience, the particular, natural, unforced encounter with a sensory stimulus that the sealed identity recognized, and that the recognizing weakened the wall, and that the weakening produced the breach, and that the breach produced the return. The experience had to be organic, had to arise from the life she was living rather than the life she had lost, had to reach her through the person she was now. Marin, the herb seller, the woman without a past, rather than through the person she had been. The reaching required patience. Patience required the specific, sustained, I will be near you without telling you who you are discipline that the neurology prescribed, and that the husband, whose wife was alive and 10 minutes away and did not know his name, was being asked to maintain. The specialist, the memories are not gone, they are inaccessible. The barrier can breach through a trigger stimulus, but the trigger must arrive as experience, not instruction. Forced recall strengthens the wall. The husband was being asked to be near his wife without telling her who she was. Patience prescribed by neurology. Discipline demanded by love. Chapter 4. He stayed in Thornfield. Constructed a reason. The infrastructure inspection extended. The itinerary modified. The particular administrative, strand-managed cover story that provided institutional justification for a king remaining in a provincial town, whose infrastructure did not, by any objective assessment, require 3 additional weeks of royal attention. The cover story was thin. Strand maintained it with the particular, professional, I know what this is actually about discretion that competent advisors provide when their king's personal needs and professional responsibilities require creative reconciliation. The 3 weeks were the hardest discipline of his life. Harder than governance, harder than the grief, harder than the 3 years of carrying the signature that said deceased, because the 3 weeks required proximity without disclosure, presence without identity, the specific, sustained, I am near you and you do not know me experience that is the particular, unique, amnesia-specific form of loss that no other form of loss replicates. She was alive. She was 10 feet away on market days. She was selling him herbs and making conversation. and looking at him with the vendor's pleasant neutrality that strangers receive. And the stranger's receiving was the wall, not the neurological wall that the trauma had built inside her brain, but the experiential wall that the neurological wall produced between them. A woman looking at a man and seeing no one she recognized. He returned to her stall, twice a week, market days, when the stall operated and the herbs were displayed and the woman behind them sang while she worked. The visits were not strategic, were not engineered, were not the calculated, trigger-seeking, I am trying to make you remember interventions that Halverson had prohibited. The visits were the particular, non-voluntary, I cannot stay away gravitational response of a man whose wife was alive and accessible, and whose accessibility was simultaneously the closest and the farthest she had ever been. They talked. Over the herb stall across the particular vendor-customer, commercial interaction framework that the stall provided and that gave the talking a structure that unstructured conversation would not have had, and that the structure maintained because unstructured conversation between a stranger and a woman who was actually his wife would have been the particular, strange, why is this man talking to me experience that would have driven her away rather than drawn her closer. The herbs gave them language. The language was safe. You know a great deal about medicinal plants, Delphine observed during his fourth visit. She was not Delphine, was Marin the name she had chosen, the identity she had built. But the knowing was present beneath the not knowing, the way water is present beneath ice, there, moving, alive, separated from the surface by a barrier that temperature maintains, and that temperature can also dissolve. My wife was a healer, Elias offered. The sentence was careful. Halvorsen had approved the general disclosure of a deceased wife's profession as non-threatening biographical information that might, through the specific indirect, I am talking about someone else framework, provide sensory echoes without direct confrontation. She worked with plants, taught me more than I expected to learn. The woman's expression softened. The softening was the particular, empathetic, I recognize grief response that healers produce when they encounter loss, and that the response was Delphine's response, the pre-voluntary, constitutional, I help people who are hurting quality that the amnesia had not erased because the quality was deeper than memory. The quality was identity. I am sorry, she murmured. Loss leaves a particular kind of silence. Not empty, heavy. Like a room where someone used to sing, and the singing has stopped but the room still holds the shape of the sound. The metaphor stopped his breathing. A room where someone used to sing, and the singing has stopped. The description of his palace, his bedroom, his life, delivered by the woman whose singing had been the sound and who did not know she was describing her own absence. The metaphor was Delphine speaking through Marin, the sealed identity producing language that the unsealed identity could not source, and that the producing was the particular, leak-through-the-wall phenomenon that Halvorsen had described as a positive indicator, pre-breach semantic echoes, meaning leaking through the barrier in the form of language that the current identity could not explain, and that the sealed identity was generating. Week 2 produced more echoes. A humming, the particular, unconscious, working while humming behavior that Delphine had exhibited during medical preparations, and that Marin exhibited during herb sorting, and that the humming on the afternoon of day 12 shifted from the ordinary market melody she usually hummed to something else. Something specific, a melodic pattern that Elias recognized in 4 notes, because the 4 notes were the opening phrase of Delphine's primary treatment song, the vocal pattern she had used most frequently in medical sessions, and that her voice had produced thousands of times, and that the producing had encoded the pattern so deeply in her vocal memory that the encoding persisted beneath the barrier and the persisting was. Producing the pattern now, in a market stall, through a woman who did not know she was humming a medical treatment protocol she could not remember learning. 4 notes, the opening phrase, then the humming stopped, the particular, abrupt, mid-phrase interruption that occurs when the unconscious production becomes conscious, and the conscious does not recognize what it is producing, and the not recognizing produces the stopping. She frowned. The frowning was the particular, internal, where did that come from, expression of a person whose own behavior has surprised them, and whose surprise is the evidence that the behavior originated from a source the current identity cannot access. That melody, Elias ventured. It is beautiful. Where did you learn it? The frown deepened. I do not know, Marin admitted. It comes sometimes, when I am working. I do not know where it is from. It feels... She stopped. The stopping was the wall, the particular, neurological, you cannot go further interruption that the barrier produced when the sealed memories were approached too closely, and that the interruption protected by preventing the approach from completing. It feels old, she finished, like I have always known it. but I do not remember learning it. Week 2, she hummed 4 notes of her own treatment song, encoded so deeply the barrier couldn't suppress it, then stopped mid-phrase frowning. I don't know where it's from, it feels old. Like I've always known it, the sealed identity leaking through the wall. Meaning without memory, sound without source, Delphine speaking through Marin in 4 notes that neither of them could explain. Chapter 5. The breach happened on day 19. Not through the treatment song, through something older, something the medical protocols had not predicted, because the medical protocols measured therapeutic patterns and professional encodings, and the thing that breached the wall was not professional. It was personal. It was the particular, intimate, deeper than professional encoding that love produces in the body's memory, and that love's encoding persists beneath every other layer because love is the deepest thing the body stores, and the deepest thing is the last thing the barrier can suppress, and the last thing the barrier suppresses is the first thing that breaches. It was raining. Market day, the stall covered by a canvas awning, the herbs protected the particular wet rain-on-canvas acoustic environment that produced a specific sound profile. Elias was at the stall. Marin was sorting chamomile. The rain intensified. The awning leaked, a single persistent drip that landed on the wooden counter between them with the particular rhythmic water-on-wood pattern that rain produces, and that the pattern was... He noticed it before she did. The pattern. The specific, rhythmic, water-on-wood frequency that the drip was producing, and that the frequency matched, not approximately, not coincidentally, exactly. The rhythm of the lullaby. The lullaby that Delphine had sung every evening during the year they were trying to conceive. The lullaby that was not a medical pattern, not a treatment song, not a professional encoding. The personal, intimate, between two people's song that she had hummed against his chest in bed while they talked about the child they hoped for. And that the child had never arrived and that the lullaby had continued anyway, because the lullaby was not for the child. The lullaby was for them. For the hoping. For the particular private, no one else hears this intimacy that bonded pairs create in the dark when the dark is safe and the safe is each other. The rain dripped, the rhythm played, and Marin, sorting chamomile, hands in the herbs, the vendor's routine operating normally, stopped. Not the mid-phrase stop of the humming incident. A full stop, the particular, total, every system-pausing stop that the body produces when the brain receives a stimulus that the barrier cannot block, because the stimulus is too deep, and the deep is the level where love lives, and love's level is beneath the barrier, and the beneath is where the breach begins. Her hands stopped sorting, her eyes went distant. The particular, inward focusing, something is happening inside gaze that dissociative states produce, when the internal processing overrides the external awareness. The gaze held for 5 seconds. 7. The rain dripped. The rhythm continued. And the rhythm was reaching the place where the lullaby lived. And the lullaby was connected to everything the lullaby had accompanied. The bed, the dark, the hoping, the voice against a chest, the particular, specific. Only one person in the world, man, whose chest the voice had been pressed against. And the connections were pulling, and the pulling was thinning the wall, and the thinning was... Her eyes refocused. Found his. And the finding was different. The customer service neutrality was gone, replaced by something that the neutrality had been covering, and that the covering had been the wall's function, and that the function was failing, because the rain was playing a rhythm that the deepest part of her recognized, and the recognizing was producing. In her eyes, the particular, surfacing I know you expression, that recognition produces when recognition has been suppressed for 3 years, and the suppression fails and the failing is visible in the eyes before it is articulable in words. She did not speak. Her mouth opened. No sound. The particular, trying to access language, the word is there but the pathway, is rebuilding silence of a brain reconnecting circuits, that the barrier had severed and that the reconnecting was producing the specific, neurological, I can almost reach it experience, that amnesia patients describe as the moment before the return, the moment when the sealed identity is pressing against the wall from the inside, and the wall is thinning, and the pressing and the thinning are producing the sensation of almost that precedes the sensation of through. A tear. 1. Tracking down her left cheek, the specific, involuntary, the body knows before the mind production of a tear that the sealed identity was producing. Because the sealed identity was reaching the surface, and the reaching was emotional before it was cognitive, and the emotion, unable to express itself through language that the reconnecting had not yet restored, expressed itself through the only channel available, the tear. Elias. The name arrived. Rough, broken, produced through a throat that was physically reconfiguring around a word it had not formed in 3 years, and that the forming was the breach, the specific singular, wall-breaking moment when the sealed identity produces the word that the barrier has been suppressing, and the word, once produced, opens the channel, and the channel once opened cannot be resealed. Elias. Her voice, not Marin's voice, Delphine's voice, the particular, specific, I know your name, I know who you are, I am coming back voice of a woman whose identity was returning through a single word and whose word was his name. The name was the breach, the name was the bridge. The name was the particular, four-letter, one person in the world sound that the deepest part of her had been holding beneath the wall for 3 years, and that the rain's rhythm had reached and released. His hand found hers across the counter, the herbs scattered, chamomile falling from the surface, the sorting undone, the commercial interaction demolished by the particular, unstoppable, the wall-is-down force of a woman's hand, gripping a man's hand with a specific full body. I remember you pressure that recognition produces, when recognition has been absent for 3 years, and the absence ends and the ending is physical before it is verbal, and the physical is a grip that does not intend to release. The rain continued. The market continued. And a woman behind an herb stall held the hand of a man she had been looking at for 3 weeks as a stranger, and who was now, through the breach that a raindrop's rhythm had initiated, not a stranger, not a customer. The man whose name her sealed identity had been holding for 3 years beneath a wall that a river had built, and that a lullaby's rhythm had finally, in a market in Thornfield, on a rainy Tuesday, brought down. Rain on wood. The rhythm matched their lullaby, the private one, the hoping one, the voice against his chest one, the deepest encoding, beneath the barrier, beneath everything. Her eyes refocused. Found his. The neutrality was gone. One tear, then his name. Rough, broken, the wall breaching through 4 letters. Her hand gripped his across scattered chamomile. 3 years of sealed identity, opened by rain playing the rhythm of a song no one else had ever heard. Epilogue, 1 year later, the return was not instant. Halvorsen had prepared them. The breach was the beginning, not the completion. Memories returned in fragments over months, pieces surfacing at unpredictable intervals. A face recognized, a skill recalled, the particular, scattered jigsaw puzzle quality of a mind reassembling an identity that had been disassembled by trauma, and that the reassembling could not perform in the neat, sequential, chapter-by-chapter order that narratives prefer. The reassembling was chaotic. Beautiful and chaotic. A woman remembering her wedding on a Wednesday morning and her childhood on a Thursday evening, and the name of her first patient on a Saturday during lunch, with no connective tissue between the memories, and no chronological framework for the connecting and the framework rebuilding itself around the fragments as the fragments accumulated. She remained in Thornfield during the recovery, not at the palace. Thornfield, where the identity she had built as Marin provided the stability that the returning identity required. Halvorsen's recommendation. The recovery environment should be the current environment. Disruption, relocation, identity replacement, the particular, comprehensive, everything changes at once upheaval that a return to the palace would produce, risks destabilizing the recovery. Let the memories return in the environment where the return began. Let the patient integrate rather than replace. Elias traveled between the capital and Thornfield with the particular consistent, she is the priority regularity that his schedule could accommodate, and that Strand's management could sustain, and that the territory's governance could tolerate because the governance, for the first time in 3 years, had a king whose engagement was increasing rather than decreasing, and whose increasing was producing better decisions and more initiative, and the particular, measurable, he is coming back quality that Lindqvist documented in her operational notes with the specific understated military professional observation. The king's functional capacity has improved. Attribution. Thornfield. Delphine's voice returned before her full memory did. The treatment songs, the therapeutic vocal patterns that the medical corps had trained her to produce, surfaced during month 3 of the recovery, emerging from the sealed memory in the particular, musical, the body remembers the melody before the mind remembers the training order that vocal memory produces. She hummed them first, then sang fragments, then, one afternoon in the cottage that had been Marin's and was becoming Delphine's, produced the full, complete, therapeutically calibrated vocal pattern that the medical corps had documented, and that the documentation had classified as the most effective non-pharmaceutical pain intervention in the territory's medical arsenal. The voice was unchanged. 3 years of silence had not degraded the frequency, the resonance, the particular omega-specific harmonic quality that made the voice medicinal. The water had taken her memory but not her instrument. The instrument had been waiting, sealed, preserved, maintained beneath the barrier with the specific, biological "this is too essential to lose" protection that the body applies to its most fundamental capacities. The voice was fundamental. The voice survived. The Brennan family was honored. The farming family who had pulled an unconscious woman from a river and cared for her for 3 years, and who had provided the particular, unconditional, "we do not need to know who you are" shelter that a person without identity requires. The Brennans received the crown's formal recognition, a designation that carried no material reward because the Brennans refused material reward with the particular frontier. We did what anyone would do modesty that riverside families produce, and that the modesty, in this case, was inaccurate because not anyone would have done what the Brennans did, and the doing was extraordinary, and the extraordinary deserved the recognition, even if the recognized insisted it was ordinary. One evening, month 11, the memories substantially returned, the identity substantially integrated, the woman who had been Marin becoming the woman who had been Delphine, becoming the woman who was both. They sat on the cottage porch. Thornfield's evening. The particular, provincial, quiet after market day calm that the town produced, and that was different from the palace's quiet because the palace's quiet was institutional, and Thornfield's quiet was natural, and natural quiet does not need to be maintained by architecture. It maintains itself. "The river took everything," she murmured. Not to him, to the evening. The observation of a woman whose memory had returned sufficiently to understand what the river had taken, and whose understanding was producing the particular, reflective, "I am assessing the damage quality that recovered amnesia patients experience when the recovery reveals the scope of the loss the amnesia had concealed." 3 years. I lost 3 years of you. The silence was brief. His hand found hers on the porch rail. The finding was easy now. The particular, practiced, we have been rebuilding, this quality of a touch that had been relearned over 11 months of the slow, careful, Halvorson-supervised reconnection that the recovery required. The river took 3 years, Elias acknowledged, but it did not take the voice. And the voice, in a market on a Tuesday, through the noise of 300 people who did not know what they were hearing, the voice reached me, before the memory returned. Before the wall came down, the voice reached me because the voice is deeper than the wall, the voice is deeper than anything, and what is deepest survives. She leaned against him, the particular, physical, "I am here and you are here" contact that the recovery had restored, and that the restoring had made more valuable than the original, because the restoring carried the specific earned, "we almost lost this quality that near loss produces," and that the near loss makes every subsequent contact a confirmation rather than a routine. The singing resumed, not immediately, gradually, over weeks, then months. The treatment songs returned to the medical corps' repertoire. The voice resumed its function, healing, treating, the particular, therapeutic, measurably effective vocal medicine that the territory's wounded had been without for 3 years, and that the return produced in the medical community, the specific professional, the "instrument is back" recognition that musicians produce when a silenced instrument plays again. The voice played again. In markets and medical wards and the cottage in Thornfield where a woman who had been lost was found, and where the finding had begun with rain on wood playing the rhythm of a lullaby that only 2 people had ever heard, and that the hearing, through a wall, through 3 years, through the particular, deep, beneath everything place where love stores the things it cannot afford to lose, had brought her back. Not the memory. The memory came later. The love came first. Through rain, through rhythm, through 4 notes of a song that the barrier could not hold because the song was stored beneath the barrier, and beneath is where the surviving happens, and the surviving is what love does when everything above it has been taken by a river and everything below it refuses to let go.